Sustainable fashion is in trouble right now. And that's not just something I've noticed. It's what I'm hearing from people who've worked in this industry for a lot longer than I have. It's also being repeated by people trying to get into the industry and not having any luck. And it's definitely being proved by the amount of small sustainable brands that keep going under as the years go on. And as someone who's been in this industry for almost a decade now, I think it's alarming that we're seeing a major drop in any progress or news being shared about how fashion is trying to tackle the biggest issue threatening its future. The fashion industry clearly doesn't want to talk about it, so we're gonna have to. Before we do, let me say welcome or welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, my name's Katie. I talk about fashion in the context of sustainability, politics, pop culture. If that sounds good to you, then make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, you're following along on the podcast for more exclusive content, and wherever else you want to find me on the internet, I'm probably there too. Just a warning before we get into today's topic, it is gonna be a frustrating one, I think, for you guys, as much as it's frustrating for me to talk about, because the entire situation happening around the fashion industry right now feels pretty bleak. And that's not even talking about the sustainability side, which feels like it's completely dropped off. Fans that have been with me on the channel for a couple of years will know that I used to do a monthly news video where I talked about the progress going on in sustainable fashion for that month and highlighted the stories that I think were really interesting, that people needed to pay more attention to. And I know a lot of you really enjoyed that, but I haven't done one of those in maybe 6 months or longer. And that's because I feel like there hasn't been enough news to fill those videos. There's been a real drop off in brands talking about new material innovations they're investing in partnerships with resale sites or other sustainability ventures, and even stories about brands being called out for doing something wrong. And that's not to say that all of these things have suddenly stopped happening. Funding has completely dried up for new materials, or things have suddenly gotten better to the point that there's nothing to be reporting on. It just feels like no one's talking about them anymore. It was Earth Month in April, and that felt so quiet. A month that's historically been filled with tons of news, with brands waiting to bring out their latest collections or their new venture funding for a sustainability program directly for this month because they knew it would hit headlines. And this year we got basically nothing. Either more brands are unwilling to open themselves up to the justifiable criticism that these kind of posts have inspired in the past, or they've just given up the pretense that they care. So we need to talk about what's happened here, why this has happened, and also how this refusal to talk about the elephant in the room, the future of the fashion industry, has opened up a whole can of worms that we really couldn't have foreseen, including the fact that H&M is now being seen as a sustainability leader purely by default. Firstly, we've got to talk about the how fashion has gone from taking sustainability as seriously as they ever have to basically deciding never to bring it up. And in order to understand that, we have to understand the state of the industry right now. In a recent video I did talking about fashion's analogue era and how that's impacted the industry, I alluded to the declining state of fashion and how it's struggling right now. And I got a comment from somebody that was something like, "How do you know fashion is struggling right now? You didn't cite any sources. You need to do that." Now, my subscribers know that I always cite my sources when I can. I'm kind of a stickler for it. But for this particular statement I made in this particular video, I didn't even know where to begin, because although you can see the declining state of the industry in every headline that you read, there's no single data point you can reference that you can point out and say, here's where it dropped off. You have to be able to look at the subtext and see the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that the fashion industry is currently collapsing under the weight of so many stresses. Obviously, that's going to impact sustainability because there's barely any money left for it and barely any headspace left to comprehend it. Not when the short-term outlook looks so bad. Not when shaky geopolitics and tyrannical dictators are creating new problems every single quarter. Not when luxury fashion has an ongoing PR crisis with their declining quality. And not when ultra-fast fashion brands are influencing legislation delays and continually undermining the rest of the market by pushing out clothes for less than a cup of coffee. The last thing on fashion's priority list is going to be voluntarily addressing big issues like sustainability, especially when they require a massive rethink of fashion's entire business model. But that's not something fashion's exactly going to admit to. So we're in the era of green hushing instead. Instead of giving us half-assed sustainability strategies or beige-filled conscious collections, they're just not going to say anything. And they're justifying that in part by saying that consumers haven't been reacting well to sustainability measures, and therefore they might not care as much about sustainability, so fashion doesn't have to make as much of an effort. But I just don't believe that. I was doing an interview recently and I got a question that was something like, do you think sustainable fashion has become a trend in itself? And my answer was that I think only brands see sustainable fashion as a trend. I think to see sustainability as a trend is to ignore how inherent the behavior is, how normal it once was to repair our clothes, how much sense financially it makes to buy something or sell something secondhand. It's only brands with their marketing machines and their capitalistic views that can see something like that as a trend that goes in and out of fashion. And right now it seems like fashion has decided sustainability is out, that it's not worth talking about, that it's not worth promoting. And I think that's such a mistake. And you only have to look at something that's happened recently in the UK to know that's a mistake. If you haven't seen the news, then you might not know, but Vinted is now the third biggest retailer in the UK. How crazy is that? A secondhand platform is now in the top 3 sites people go to shop. And that's just one secondhand platform. That's not counting any of the others we have here. And I think it's worth examining this a little bit further, because I think unlike other areas of sustainable fashion, resale has had the time to prove its financial viability. Not only that, it's been proven you can make it aspirational in a way that will draw consumers that care about their fashion sense, about novelty, as well as the planet. And maybe that's why we've seen brands leaning into resale, even as they lean away from other sustainability ventures. We saw this normalization most recently with the Met Gala, where eBay was one of the main partners. Unfortunately, we had to see that red carpet shared with the fast fashion brands like Zara and like Gap. And at an event where wealth was so clearly on display, it's not as if brands could make the argument that they were trying to make these designs accessible to the masses. No, this was clearly a ploy to glamorize the mass production models that these brands feed off of and show their designs on celebrities that definitely have the net worth to either demand much better designs from archival or vintage, or at least support smaller, more independent designers, which is something the industry is desperately craving right now. What gives me hope is the way people saw through this immediately. And it brings me back to my point that I think people genuinely do want a better fashion industry, because we don't have the money or the mental capacity to keep buying without thought like we have in the fast fashion golden age. In fact, I believe the age of overconsumption is over. And that feels like a big thing to say, but I think that's where we're heading. It doesn't mean we're going to stop buying completely, but I do think the how and when and why we buy is going to become more important. And that consumer behavior is something I analysed a lot in the analogue fashion industry video. So I don't want to talk about how consumers are interpreting this shift right now. I want to talk about why brands are ignoring it and the consequences of that. They're still just trying to shove a broken fashion industry down our throats and rely on that short-term gain to stave off the inevitable problems that are hurtling towards them because they haven't thought long-term in a few years. And I want to talk about the unintended consequences that come when you shut off long-term thinking. I mentioned something pretty shocking earlier, which is that H&M is now being seen as somewhat of an industry leader when it comes to sustainability. And that's basically because they're one of the only large brands that are still willing to talk about it. It's one of the few brands still promoting their sustainability reports, and their latest one actually showed some signs of progress that few brands are achieving right now. And trust me when I say they've been on a press run promoting the fact that they're the ones talking about sustainability to anyone who will listen. I've seen multiple articles highlighting this, and in one with Vogue Business, the chief sustainability officer said that H&M has set their strategy to decouple their financial growth from resource use. And that sounds great. That sounds like H&M is trying to move away from extreme and irresponsible resource use made to produce more clothing than anyone needs in order to keep that profit margin looking healthy. It sounds like they're trying to investigate other ways that don't involve making more clothes. And it sounds great when you say it like that. But as I said, it's dangerous to have fast fashion brands be the leading voice for sustainability in the fashion industry, because they were so quick to admit how warped that view of sustainability actually is from their perspective. They literally admitted in the same interview, our strategy is not based on reducing quantities, which, given we've already got enough clothing to clothe the next 6 generations, how does creating more clothing fit any kind of sustainability messaging? It boggles the mind how they can so confidently come out with something like that when doing an interview about their sustainability messaging. And that's the danger when an industry-wide silence on a problem means that anyone willing to talk about it looks good in comparison. That's what's happening here with H&M. And they're not even really trying to hide the fact that there's barely any progress here. That becomes clear when you go further into this. So part of their strategy is a new partnership with Stella McCartney, who has a certain reputation in the industry for being a sustainability-focused designer, although that arguably slipped off when LVMH took a controlling stake in her company a few years ago, before she eventually bought back that controlling stake last year. Anyway, this new collection with H&M is being blown way out of proportion, in my opinion. It is nothing groundbreaking. It does the usual prioritizing natural materials like organic cotton and better alternatives to conventional materials like acetate and viscose. There's also been a lot of hype about how the product listings include information about the materials, like the fact that polyester is made from oil. But again, this is not groundbreaking, not like actually phasing out synthetic materials would be. And it feels like a lot of ass kissing from the industry. And that point was further proven when I read the interview McCartney did with Vogue, where they were very clear to highlight that McCartney isn't ignorant of skepticism about her latest collection. They include a very clear quote where she says, "Yes, this is fast fashion. It's not perfect. Often it's shit, but we can make it less shit." The fact that Vogue's angle on this quote is, wow, she's being so transparent, rather than even she knows that this is not actually progress, tells you everything you need to know about the state of fashion journalism right now, and how fashion has been able to get away with being so quiet, so permissive on the lack of progress of sustainability for so long, because fashion media is no longer challenging it. I mean, yes, McCartney being honest by saying this is still fast fashion does get her some brownie points, but that shit but better line isn't exactly going to be used in marketing material to promote this collection, is it? One more thing about this H&M collection before we move on to other consequences is the part of the collab that's seen H&M come out with a insights board, a board they say is designed to continue dialogue around sustainability in fashion. If that sounds like very beige, vague wording, that's because it is. This insights board includes technologists and sustainability innovators, global brand ambassadors for H&M, fashion editors and journalists, topic experts from H&M, McCartney herself. So we've really got a variety of people there, but apparently missing from those experts is garment workers that make H&M's clothes, the farmers and the factory managers, all the people that are in H&M's supply chain who have first-hand experience of how their relentless churn of clothes actually impacts the land they're using and the people making it. I mean, at every step, this partnership has felt half-assed. And it's a double-edged sword because a player as big as H&M refocusing fashion's attention on sustainability should be a good thing. But it's clear it only seems like progress because of the narrative being built around it and the fact we barely have anything else to compare it to. I do want to talk about some of the other more subtle ways we're seeing progress and why it's different from what H&M are doing. Because the reason for this progress isn't exactly coming from brands making progressive steps. It's more like an accidental consequence of other things happening in the industry forcing brands to pivot. Like, for example, the sudden change in narrative around polyester. So the anti-polyester movement has been growing for years now, Alden Wicker is just one of the people that have been shouting into the void about how it has potential negative impacts on our health. But fashion has largely been able to ignore this in favor of bringing out more oil-based activewear sets and replacing expensive natural fibers with cheap polyester in most of their products. However, since this has been picked up by TikTok and the polyester is bad for your health narrative has exploded in 2025, 2026, brands have now seen that this has a marketing angle. And BOF is reporting that brands are now happily pivoting into the anti-polyester hype as a way of linking their clothes to the billion-dollar wellness industry. More brands are shouting about their natural fibers. They're saying they're getting rid of polyester. And look, I can't be mad about that if that means we're getting less fossil fuel-based fashion. But I'm mad it took a TikTok trend and oil prices surging from geopolitical issues to make any kind of progress on a problem fashion has known about for decades. It's known how unsustainable its reliance on polyester has been. It's been in big oil's pocket for years, and it's only now that it wants to pay attention to that. I'll give you another example that's even more convoluted. Zara, like H&M, is another brand that hasn't quite dropped its sustainability messaging, and a large part of their new collab with designer John Galliano was marketed as them reworking the archives of past collections, reimagining popular Zara styles from years back and giving them a refresh. Galliano called it really sustainable from a creative point of view in a Vogue interview. And that's not only laughable as a concept, because what archives do fast fashion brands have other than copies of other people's designs? But I saw someone else say, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who, that this reworking the archives is very suspiciously timed with new legislation coming in that punishes fashion brands for the destruction of unsold goods. So instead of paying fines for their mountains of unsold inventory, which is a problem a lot of fashion brands are facing, and Zara is definitely one of them, Zara get to rebrand their waste and probably produce more of it behind the guise of a designer collab. And look, once again, both of these unintended consequences are arguably good things. But it's the motivation behind it that leaves me so frustrated, because it proves fashion continues to ignore what people want and what they morally should do until they're forced not to by other circumstances. And then they get to manipulate the narrative into making us think that they did what we wanted them to do all along. I'm sorry for doing such a frustrating video. It's a topic I've been noticing a lot recently. The absence of any news going on in sustainable fashion, the fake progress we're getting from the brands that dare talk about it, and the complete lack of responsibility from fashion media questioning brands rather than just being their PR puppets. I think it's all converging into this big disconnect between what fashion is doing and what people want fashion to do. And if anything, it makes me think that, one, it's really, really important to support independent fashion journalism that is actually willing to call brands out on their mistakes. And two, the brands that actually take a step back and look at the shifts going on for consumers are going to be the ones that win long term. And it's that changing consumer behavior that gives me hope, even as we talk about something as frustrating as sustainable fashion progress continuing to stall. My next video is going to be very, very relevant actually, because I'm going to be reviewing some fashion magazines that you guys have recommended to me that I've found on my own and picked up because they look great. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel for that, because again, I think fashion journalism is where it's at right now. We need to be paying attention to it. And with that, I'll leave this video here. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, you're following me on any other social media you want to, and I hope to see you guys very soon. Okay, bye everybody.